Wood here, Magical Experimenters, and I thought I would go ahead and do this video an hour earlier today than I normally do because, well, sometimes life has to be a little bit variable, and it's a good thing, and that's what I'm doing here. So, in this case, we're exploring the topic of how to do magic for your life when life is good. How to do magic that sustains the good times in your life and why you would even want to do that. And what prompted this was basically the other day, my dear friend Bara made the point that, it's a good idea to do magic when life is going well, because when life is good, to sustain the flow. And then another good friend of mine, Elise, made the equally applicable point that it's actually a good example of good life skills when you're doing magic to sustain the good times of your life and to keep things practical. I mean that's a summation of what they said, but you get the idea. And I thought about it, and I'm like, yeah, that's true. I mean, that's how I approach a lot of my magical work. So I thought I would talk about that topic and present my own perspective on it. Not that my perspective is any more is automatically better or worse than anyone else's, but because I want to share my own thoughts on the topic. Because if you look at the majority of my magical work, it is really built around doing magic for the long term, for doing it for long term gain, long term success, and in building off of what is already working well in my life, what is working good. And in counterpoint to that, I think when a lot of people think of magic, they think of magic in terms of solving problems, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, problem comes up in your life, do a magical spell, boom, problem is solved, and life goes on. But really, let's consider for a moment what we're really bringing into that perspective. Okay, I have a problem in my life. I decide to use magic to solve it. Now suddenly I'm back to where I was with my life. We're basically moving back from bad to neutral. Well, why don't we take it a step further and move it from bad to neutral to good? Why don't we look at not only doing that, but sustaining it so that it's good for the long haul? Life is always going to bring with it complications and problems and things like that. I mean, that's just the reality of it. You think everything is going well with your life, and then suddenly you do something, or some situation occurs, or whatever else, and everything gets thrown up into the air, and you've got to sort things out. That happens, and those are good reasons to do magic when you need to solve problems in your life. But sometimes you can do magic because you don't want to just solve a problem, but because you want to build off of what's already there. You want things to work out better than they are. And I think that when we take that approach to magic, what we really want to do is we want to look at like what is good in our life and why it's good, and then we want to say to ourselves, and what could we do to extend this even further? What could we do to build off what is already there? What could we do to take the momentum that currently is working for us and cause it to work further? I mean, really, a proactive approach to wealth magic is exactly what that's about. My approach to wealth magic, for example, is always built around the idea of not just, oh, I need to do wealth magic in order to get money, but rather I need to do wealth magic from a strategic perspective. I need to look at the long term. Like, what am I even getting that money for? How am I using that to help me with my life? And how can I build off of that? And in some cases, I'm even looking, like, far down the line. Like, I'm looking at like some of my wealth magic is really just focused on like, where am I going to be 30, 40, 50 years from now, as opposed to where I am right now in this moment. Not that this moment can be improved upon or built off of, but rather because anything I do now is going to necessarily affect what happens in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so if I want to take an approach of building sustainability into my life, and building something where the good times outweigh the bad times, and where I keep the flow going, I don't want to look even just at the short term. I want to look at the long term. I want to look at where I'm going to be down the line and what actions I can take now, magically and mundanely, in order to get me where I want to go. So when I do my own magical workings, I always look at it from a long-term perspective, because it's not enough to just solve a problem in the moment if we're not in fact enchanting for down the line and where things could go. So case in point, I many moons ago, my wife and I created a an entity called Good Job, and the purpose of Good Job was basically to help her find a job that was going to allow her to um, not just get that job, but then build a career off that job and get regular advancements. We did this about 10 years ago, and I would say that that job hunting entity, which really became a career entity, has definitely helped to build a much more sustainable lifestyle for us. And it happened because of that magical work that we did to create the entity. I mean, she was able to get a job, and then after that, she got a promotion within a year, not even like a full year later, within the year. And then after that, every 3 years after that, she would get promotions. And so it's a good example of how you build something you build something like a magical entity, and your focus is, okay, I need to solve this immediate problem, but then also, what can I do to build off of the success of solving that problem and create a long-term sustainable approach to magical work that's going to carry me from this moment now to down the line. And that's what I basically ended up coming up with along with her. We both came up with it, but it's what we came up with as a response to building long-term sustainability into our lives, long-term success, so that we weren't just focused on the immediate short-term outcome, but on the long-term results. Another example that I'm going to use is one based around finding opportunities for myself. I I can be a very hyper focused person, and so one of the things that I decided to do was create a magical entity for the purposes of building a long term vision around finding the necessary opportunities that I might otherwise miss out on if, in fact, I wasn't aware of them. And so, what the entity does is it continually makes me aware of those opportunities. And it's helped me. I created this entity in my early 20s, and it's basically over 20 years later, it's helped me find consistently amazing opportunities in my life that have helped me do things that I might otherwise have never gotten to do. It's another example of long-term working. Now, I'm sharing magical entities here because a lot of my long-term work is focused around magical entities, because I'm the kind of person that likes to set stuff and have it working in the background so that I can focus on other things. But I mean, other examples that I would share with you could be doing long-term magical work around your health, long-term magical work around your lifestyle, long-term work around experiences that you want to have. It really comes right down to this. You have to figure out what you really want in life and what you're going to do to get that thing. And this is why I always advocate a strategic approach to your magical work, because if you know what you want and you have an overall strategy, then you can figure out the tactics, the magical workings, and things like that, and start putting everything together in order to help you get where you want to go. You never want to just solely live in a tactical headspace when it comes to life. And a lot of people do. And by a tactical headspace, I mean really like, okay, problem comes along. What tactic am I going to use to resolve this problem and get back to where I was before? I mean, again, short term that works great, but it's survival focused, survival oriented, and we want to focus on long term success. We want to focus on building off the flow of what we've got. We do that by really taking the time to examine carefully, like, what is it that I want to manifest in my life? How am I going to get that thing? What is it that I'm going to need to do to help carry me forward so that I'm consistently getting the things that I want in life? And again, I'm going to share with you that this doesn't mean that you're never going to encounter problems. I mean, sometimes you will. But also, let's be honest here, most of our problems are, to some degree or another, of our own manufacturing. I'm not saying you're solely responsible for your problems. Okay, I want to be very clear about that, because sometimes there are factors and variables and things you wouldn't have even considered that can bring a problem into your life. But the one thing that all of your problems have in common is they have you and your role in those problems. That doesn't mean that you should beat yourself up or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is that you want to recognize your participation in the problem so that you can start making changes. A lot of my long-term work has really been around internal work. So I've had situations in my life where I've sabotaged myself in different ways, and afterwards I've been like, well, why did I do that? And I'm like, well, because I had this pattern here or I had this pattern there. And so then I go in and I start undoing and dissolving that pattern and start changing the behaviors. I'll admit it's a hindsight approach to take things, but sometimes that's how things go. But then what it does is you carry it further forward and you're like, okay, now that I've made this change, I know this is never going to happen again because I'm going to do these things. Now, if you can be proactive with your internal work and you can be like, okay, I had this happen, but I'm going to continue doing internal work and I'm going to start really picking through the patterns and behaviors. And I'm going to start noticing like what I brought into a situation, and I'm going to start working through that situation, and I'm going to start being proactive and applying that forward so that I don't even put myself into those situations. That's another example of a strategic approach where you're building off of something, an experience, maybe a bad one, but you're building off of it. You can take the same approach toward good experiences. You can be like, man, I had these awesome experiences. What can I do to replicate these experiences? What made these experiences what they were? By taking such an approach, you really give yourself a way of consistently showing up in your life in a way that produces better results and overall happiness for you. You're not going to be happy all the time. I mean, nobody is. I mean, sometimes I get depressed or unhappy about things, and sometimes you end up making mistakes out of that stuff. But if you can if you can learn to recognize what is going on and separate out the emotions from the actions, then what ends up happening is you end up making better choices because you don't necessarily act on the emotions. You acknowledge them, you recognize them, you work through them and feel them, but you don't let them control you. Instead, you just learn to feel and acknowledge them, and then you make different choices than you would otherwise. These are good things to do. And this is also how you build off a long-term approach to magic, because you're never going to always be in a good place. But when you are in a good place, you want to build off of that. You want to sustain that current. And when you are in a good place, you want to recognize what got you there and then make the changes you need to. And I do want to talk a little bit about building off of the momentum of something that's good. One thing I did many years ago is when I was back in my academic days, I had moved to Kent State. I didn't know anyone, and I wanted to meet people who practiced magic. And so what I did is I decided to do a magical working where I took the experience of meeting someone new that I enjoyed getting to know and who practiced magic, and I took that experience and I broadcast it outward into the environment around me. And I put it into place, and then what I did is I started walking around and I let my intuition guide me, and I ended up meeting a bunch of different people in the area who practice magic. I didn't even go to like the obvious places. Like in some cases it was like going to a coffee shop and then happening to bump into someone there and start talking with them and finding out that they practice magic, or it was things along those lines. But what this did is it basically, every time I had the experience of meeting somebody, I re-evoked that magical working so that it would continue to replicate and build off of the initial experience of meeting someone. So what ended up happening is within like a week, I ended up meeting a bunch of people that I otherwise probably wouldn't have met at all, because I just trusted my intuition. I let my intuition be guided by the magical working, and I ended up going to different places and meeting people. So that's another example of where you can build off of something, and you can take the same principle and apply it to your magical work when it comes to any situation. Like, let's say, you know, you finished a piece of art that you created, and you're like, man, I'm really happy about that, I want to do more of that. You could take the feeling of achievement and accomplishment and evoke that into the environment around you, and use that to help you build momentum so that you're more creative. This is kind of one of the approaches that I take with my creative work, where what I'll do is I'll take my writing, and for each book that I write, it builds off of the momentum of previous books, and it basically builds forward, so that I'm able to continue to write, and I'm inspired, and I'm continually putting out work. And this is one of my secrets to productivity. It's not the only one, but it's a good example of building off of a positive current in your life where things are going well, and you're like, okay, I want to continue to build off of that. I want to make that happen. Take the experience of achieving something and evoke it, and basically send it out there so that it calls to more experiences, and then you'll find that you are guided toward those specific experiences, or that the necessary disciplines and actions that need to occur start occurring, because it basically gets built into how you do things every day. And if you're like, well, Taylor, that's great, but a lot of that even just sounds like building good habits. Well, I mean, that is part of it. It's building good habits, but it's also building magic into your habits. A practice that I've started doing, I started doing it a little over a month ago, is a daily gratitude practice, where basically every day I write out 3 things that I'm grateful for, and I share them. And what I found interesting is that it's become easier and easier to do this gratitude practice, because every day the act of writing it is evoking that gratitude practice. And what am I doing at the same time? I'm building a current of a recognition and appreciation for what I have, and at the same time calling for more. It may seem a little fluffy, but the fact of the matter is, you have to understand that what you're really doing is you're working with a very specific principle, where you're saying, okay, I like this, and I like what I have, and I want more of it. Well, I'm going to take the experience, and I'm going to evoke it into the environment around me, so that it brings more of that into my situation. And you can do that any number of ways. I mean, you could do it as a sigil, you could do it as a spell, you could, whatever you want to do. I mean, the key thing is that you understand the principles, and then you can take the concept and turn it into a practical magical working. In my case, I use writing for that purpose, but that's me. All right, I just wanted to share this with you, and I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day. And if you're interested in learning more about a strategic approach to magic, check out the link to the Strategic Magic course that I've included in the description for this video. Thank you, and take care.